Okay, hello, welcome to the fourth lecture in which we're going to finally start coming to grips with the terms of Hobbes's social contract, at least in a preliminary way at the end of today's lecture. Last time I was talking about the source of the problems that Hobbes believes would plague his state of nature, any situation in which individuals attempt to live together in a situation of complete anarchy with no state to rule them. Hobbes's view is that the state of nature would be a nightmare, less, I think, and I was trying to emphasize this, less, I think, because human beings are just predisposed towards cruelty and nastiness and violence and assholehood and all of these things. It's less a matter of personality than it is a matter of the structure of the relationships that would exist between individuals in an anarchic situation as he describes it. And I said that the source of the problem is in a certain kind of right that individuals in the state of nature would assert for themselves because of their overriding interest in survival and self-preservation. They would assert, I didn't use this language in the last lecture, but as you know from your reading, this is Hobbes's term, they would assert the right of nature. And this is a kind of human right for him. So it's a natural right. It's a right that he thinks any rational person in the state of nature would claim for themselves and recognize in others too. And the right of nature confers on individuals the right to decide for themselves how best to pursue their own security, how best to ensure their own survival as best they can. It's the domination of that claim, right? The reservation by each individual in the state of nature of that right that is the deep source of the problem of the state of nature. As we will eventually see, it is, of course, also the key to unlocking Hobbes's view about why the powers of the state turn out in his theory to be so extensive, because it's going to turn out that the right of nature is inherited by the state and then exercised on behalf of everybody. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to stay in the state of nature and understand how the reservation of this right of nature by each individual creates the problem to which Hobbes is eventually going to argue the state provides a solution. As he sometimes says, the right of nature confers on agents a blameless liberty to dispossess other people of things they've got, to attack and harm others, and even in some cases to kill others when they judge these various actions to conduce to their survival. If it seems to me in a state of nature that I need your bow and arrow to survive, then I can quite legitimately and blamelessly snatch it out of your hands to attack the other people who I perceive to be an immediate threat to me. And similarly, as I was saying at the end of the last lecture, I have the right, under the right of nature, I'm entitled to preemptively kill others whom I deem to be a threat to my survival. And everybody thinks this in a state of nature, right? At least as Hobbes construes it, because everybody accepts that everybody has this right. And if everybody accepts that that right exists and recognizes that right, then they're not in a position to blame each other for taking their stuff or for attacking them or for trying to kill them, right? Because they're entitled to do those things under the right of nature, because those things, if they are judged by an agent to be necessary for their survival, the right of nature confers upon them a blameless liberty to perform those actions. It follows, Hobbes thinks, that there can't really be any stable conception of justice or injustice, any stable view of moral norms, understandings of what's moral and immoral, nor, crucially, any stable property in the state of nature. Because the right of nature gives agents an entitlement to anything that they judge needful for their self-preservation. So again, to use the bow and arrow example, you may think that your bow and arrow is yours because you've constructed it, right? But if I judge in some stressful situation that as a matter of necessity, I need to snatch your bow and arrow to defend myself, I have a complete blameless right to do that. And nobody else has any business getting in my face and saying, how dare you do that? Because everybody else would be asserting exactly the same thing all the time, threatening each other in various ways, taking other people's junk, attacking each other, preemptively in some cases, not because they're nasty people, but because they're desperately trying to preserve themselves as they see fit in the face of a situation that is structurally one of endemic conflict, right? So the right of nature really creates all kinds of really very profound problems on Hobbes's view. Notice, too, that the way Hobbes models his right of nature, quite intentionally, Hobbes is incorporating the psychological relativism that I was emphasizing in the last lecture. Yes, it's true that on Hobbes's view, self-preservation is a universal motive, and it's true on Hobbes's view that everyone would recognize everybody else's right to decide how best to defend themselves and survive, right? In that sense, the right of nature is a universal thing. But what the right of nature does is to protect each agent's discretion to judge what is a threat to them. And how different people are going to judge threats is, of course, going to vary with their psychology. You know, some people are more cautious. Some people are more impetuous. There is, in the end of the day, Hobbes thinks, no right answer to the question in any given situation, what is a threat to my survival, right? I actually think that our COVID pandemic and people's responses to it give a very good illustration of what Hobbes has in mind. It's completely uncontroversial. No one rationally wants to get the coronavirus. No one wants to expose themselves to the risk of death by contracting the disease. But notoriously, as we've seen over the last 8-9 months, however long it's been, feels like 18 years, notoriously different individuals judge that risk in very different ways, right? Some people are very, very cautious, and they want to say, let's quarantine absolutely everybody, do radical contact tracing. Others are much more willing to take the risk. And I think it's worth noting, en passant, that, of course, you know, these different perceptions of the risk that COVID poses are very likely to be connected to people's economic situation. It's not an accident that it tends to be less advantaged groups in our society who are more opposed to lockdowns and quarantines because they have more to lose from them. And people like me, I'm sitting on a nice, cushy academic job with an organization, that, you know, the University of Virginia, which is very unlikely to go belly up anytime soon. So my situation is safe. My livelihood is not really significantly threatened by lockdowns. And so, you know, from somebody in my position, it's pretty easy to say, let's lock everything down and keep my kids safe. But others whose jobs are very likely to be lost and whose livelihoods are very likely to be lost and who face if anything, even more serious threat to their survival and self-preservation from really, really extensive lockdowns, they're very likely to see the question differently from their point of view. Now, of course, we're thinking about COVID not in a state of nature, but that case, I think, illustrates the phenomenon that Hobbes is trying to model in talking about the right of nature, that ultimately there is no completely correct or incorrect answer in any given situation to the question, is this a threat to me? Ultimately, in the absence of some settled judge or state or system of moral norms, none of which, of course, would exist, Hobbes thinks, in a state of nature. Each of us would be left to make those judgments according to the lights of our own appetites and aversions. And since people's psychologies differ in this regard, different people are going to judge similar situations in different ways, right? So notice that. I think it makes Hobbes's views about self-preservation quite relevant to our current situation. And I'll be talking about the pandemic and the role of the state in protecting people from it on a Hobbesian account later on in these lectures. So if you were in a state of nature, Hobbes thinks, you're not complete morons, right? You'd start to see that the problem is this right of nature. As long as people reserve this right to decide for themselves how best to defend themselves, we're going to be stuck in this cycle of mutual fear and mutual suspicion. So the right of nature is the problem. That's, although it, in a way, comes out of our desire to secure ourselves, when it's generalized as a right that we all acknowledge, it turns out to be self-defeating. It's actually a threat to everyone's security. And as you know, Hobbes thinks that even in a state of nature, people are going to recognize that. So they're going to be able to figure out, you would be able to figure out in a state of nature, the outlines of a solution to the problem. And he says that you'd be able to discern what he calls a law of nature, a set of basic rules which, if everyone followed them, would solve this problem. The law of nature enjoins people to seek peace, because in the end they want to secure their own survival, and peace they regard quite reasonably as a precondition for this. It involves the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in the state of nature, seeking peace and following the golden rule, Hobbes thinks, implies that everyone would be willing to reciprocally surrender the right of nature and then follow the basic precepts of the law of nature as he describes them. And as you know, in the book, he goes on to deduce a whole series of rather more specific precepts from the golden rule. And he regards these as particular provisions of the law of nature. He calls them theorems of peace, rules that if you could get everybody to follow, would certainly alleviate the problem. And I just want to mention a couple of the precepts that Hobbes thinks are included within this picture of the law of nature, that are included within his theorems of peace. Law 3 says, everyone should keep their promises. If I make an agreement with you, if I sign a contract with you, then, and you do what you've said you're going to do, then I'm obligated as a matter of justice to follow through and do my part of the bargain, complete the deal, right? And that's law 3. Everyone should keep their promises. If they've made a promise, they're obligated under the law of nature to follow through. Number 9 says everyone should treat each other as equals. And although, for reasons I'll get into later, he does have a view that permits slavery under some circumstances, the point of Law 9 is to say that natural slavery, the idea that anyone is naturally anyone's slave, a view that Aristotle had defended, for example, is inconsistent with the golden rule. It's inconsistent with the idea that everybody ought, ideally, to recognize each other as an equal and treat them with the respect they are due as such. So Law 9 is, again, likely to strike us as a very sensible and attractive moral norm, if we could get everybody to follow it. Law 8, this is to put it in terms that he obviously isn't using. I'm using the 21st century term here. But Law 8 forbids overt contempt for others. And it corresponds to what we would call a hate crime, right? People who broadcast or publish disparaging, contemptuous epithets and apply them to their fellow citizens. The law of nature, on Hobbes' view, forbids that because it's a threat to everyone's survival, in part because of glory. If you start being spiteful and nasty and disparaging in that way, people will react badly, and that will tend to encourage violence, and that will undermine peace and order. So law 8 is worth mentioning. And more generally, law 11 and 13, both in slightly different ways, call for a sense of equity, justice, and impartiality in mutual dealings. So it's not as if in a state of nature you would be unable in peaceful moments to think about what a slightly less perverse and crazy social order would look like. You could see the outlines of a solution, and you indeed recognize these precepts as things that people have some kind of obligation to follow if everyone were prepared to follow suit. So you might say then, well, why don't people just in the state of nature, on Hobbes' view, why don't they just negotiate with each other, sign a series of agreements in which they say, okay, fine, I'll lay down my right of nature if you lay down yours. Let's all agree to follow the law of nature. Let's all agree to keep our promises and contracts. Let's all follow the golden rule, observe equity, forbid natural slavery, agree not to have hate crimes and to take legal action against those who perform them, and so forth. Why can't we just solve the problem that way? And Hobbes thinks that would not happen in the state of nature, and you would never be able to actually enter into these negotiations in a way that would lead anywhere. And the reason for this is that in a state of nature, basically, everyone is in a kind of circular firing squad situation. We're all reserving this right of nature. We're all constantly threatening each other and claiming the right to threaten those whom we deem individually to be a threat to us. So we're more or less in this situation of mutual fear, pointing our weapons at each other and asserting a right to do so. And Hobbes thinks in that situation, it'd be very, very difficult for us to just, as it were, if you use the guns as a metaphor for laying down the right of nature, it would be very, very difficult for us to just spontaneously start cooperating on that basis. And there are at least 3 connected reasons for this. Hobbes doesn't separate them, but I think it's worth just talking about them as slightly different facets of the problem. One problem is a problem about time. Suppose we agree, let's all lay down our guns or lay down our right of nature. We could reach that agreement in words, right? We could all say, yeah, I'm prepared to do that. I'm prepared to do that. We could all put up our other hand and say, yeah, I'll put down my weapon, right? But the agreement itself, right, although it's a kind of promise, it's a kind of undertaking to everybody, in order for it to actually go into effect, somebody has to put their gun down first, right? Because it's only when, under that agreement, somebody puts their weapon down that others are then going to be under an obligation to follow suit. The problem is, no one would go first. And you should ask yourself, in a state of nature, would you go first? Would you be prepared to lay down your right of nature? And Hobbes is betting you wouldn't, because you'd be afraid that others would then take advantage of you. You'd put your gun down, everybody else would be pointing their weapon at you, someone would shoot you and take your gun, and we'd be back where we were before, right? So one problem is a problem about time. Relatedly, there's a problem about assurance, right? Yes, people can say we're going to do this, and yes, we can say we're going to follow our promises afterwards, right? But we would need to have some assurance that everyone is prepared to follow through on that for some time into the future, right? And in a state of nature, Hobbes thinks, people wouldn't trust each other enough. They wouldn't have the assurance that everybody would always be motivated to follow through. You'd worry that some people, not necessarily all, but enough, would take advantage of any agreement that was reached and say, okay, fine, you're all suckers. Now we're going to take advantage of the fact that your weapons are down and oppress you or exploit you in some way. And because we don't have an assurance that other people are going to be motivated to follow through on any commitments, again, we'll be very, very cagey and reluctant to just lay down our right of nature on the basis of any simple bilateral negotiation in a situation like the circular firing squad. Thirdly, and again, obviously relatedly, there's an information problem, right? In the state of nature, we have a certain amount of information about our own motives. We know what we care about, and we know that everybody else cares about their survival. But we don't know a whole lot about other people's actual personal dispositions, right? We don't know whether other people are complete jerks and assholes and psychopaths, or whether they're actually, once we sign this agreement, whether their intentions are generally benevolent. We just don't know enough about other people's psychology and motivation to feel confident that we can trust them. So it's very closely related to the trust deficit I mentioned under number 2. But I think it's helpful to see these as 3 different aspects of the problem with which Hobbes is concerned, even if he doesn't actually lay them out. Hobbes concludes from all of this that because of this difficulty about time, someone would have to go first, someone would have to perform first, and therefore that any verbal agreement we entered into in this situation would be, as it were, just words, right? Until somebody actually goes first, right? As he says, covenants that are merely words are just words. They're not really effective until there's some enforcement mechanism. Similarly, the problems about information, trust, and assurance, all of these problems are insoluble in a state of nature, because in a state of nature, we lack the one agency, which of course he's going to say is the state, and this is his basic job description of the state. We lack the one agency that has the power and the authority to guarantee to everyone that people will in fact follow through on their promises, to give us a reasonable assurance that people can be trusted, right? We need to get that assurance, we need some third-party enforcement mechanism. So we can't just produce that third-party enforcement mechanism by direct negotiation. We need some special kind of agreement, one that first establishes a state as a third-party enforcement mechanism. Only then, if we first get to that stage, is there any chance that the laws of nature can go into effect and agents can start reaping the advantages of civil order and civil peace, right? So again, this just repeats. So without that third-party enforcer, what's going to happen is we'll each remain with our guns pointed at each other. Each will reserve the right of nature. Each will reserve the right to judge for themselves how best to preserve themselves and pursue their own survival and security. And the result will be that everyone will continue to claim a right to anything they need, that nothing can be unjust. There will be no stable property because there will be no consensus on what is yours and what is mine. And without that third-party enforcement mechanism, we'll never get to first base with any project to get people to follow through on their promises and enact and pursue the law of nature, right? So we need a special social agreement, one that first establishes a state. And I'll get into question of what that agreement looks like in a moment. But I want to emphasize something about the nature of the problem that Hobbes is trying to highlight here. I think it's really important to see, this is a slightly subtle point, but I think you'll appreciate the power of Hobbes's argument if you're clear that Hobbes is not making an argument of the following kind. He's making a different kind of argument, which I'll explain in a moment. The problem with the state of nature is not what you might call selfish amoralism, right? That the problem is not that Hobbes is postulating that it is just irrational for self-interested agents who are trying to maximize their own personal benefit. It's just irrational for them ever to comply with any norm or any agreement when violating that norm or agreement would bring them a higher payoff for themselves, right? You've probably, many of you've studied economics, and modern economics postulates that individuals are rational utility maximizers, right? So what it means to act rationally in that economics model is to always be trying to look out for opportunities to maximize your own personal benefits. And that, for an economist, is the alpha and omega of what it means to be rational. Modern economics presupposes a kind of rational, maximizing egoism. And some are tempted to read Hobbes, and there are certainly passages that may point in that direction. I don't want to completely foreclose this interpretation. There are certainly some passages, and many people are inclined to read Hobbes as saying that people are basically rational utility maximizers, and in general it's not rational for people to comply with norms and agreements when violating those norms and agreements would in fact maximize benefits to them, right? I don't in fact think that that's Hobbes's position. Hobbes's position is a little bit different. And the reason why I think it's clear that this isn't Hobbes's position is that Hobbes insists that even in a state of nature, if I've promised to you that if you give me your bag of apples, I will hand over this bundle of wood, right? And then you, having made that agreement, actually hand over your apples, then I am under an obligation now to turn over my bundles of wood. And that obligation is not subject to cancellation if later on I decide, well, it's not in my personal interest anymore to turn over my wood to you. And so I'm going to just ignore this promise, right? Hobbes is quite clear that someone, even if they have good reasons, because it would bring them greater personal benefit to violate that agreement, Hobbes makes it quite clear that in a state of nature, you'd still be obligated, you'd still do something wrong, right, by not turning over your bundle, or I would do something wrong if I didn't hand over to you the bundle of wood, right? So he insists that that's the case, even in a state of nature. And that leads me to think that he doesn't hold this kind of selfish amoralist position that says, look, if you can do even better by violating promises, then you have every reason to do so. I don't think that's the problem that Hobbes is concerned about. After all, he spends a great deal of time pointing out that even in a state of nature, you'd be able to see that the laws of nature have a certain kind of rational force because they promote peace and civic civic concord. The problem in the state of nature is not that if you gave me your apples, I wouldn't be under any obligation to give my wood to you if it were against my personal interests to do so. The problem is we'd never get to the point where after the verbal agreement you'd actually hand over your apples, right? And so that the actual obligation would never become effective. It would never go into effect because we'd have a merely verbal agreement, and until you've actually done your part of the bargain, no real obligation on my part exists to do my part, right? That's the problem of the state of nature. And it seems to me that Hobbes has to take something like this position because he well understands something that I think on reflection most of us would also understand, that the authority that the state claims to enforce the law and so forth is independent of the question of whether agents would find it in their rational self-interest to comply with the law, right? I mean, this is a pretty familiar feature of the way the law is enforced in all modern societies, at least all ones that I know of. You know, it's no defense to a charge of theft or murder that you can say to the court, yeah, but I would have been a lot better off if I had this guy's property. Or even, it's no defense to say, look, we'd all be better off, or we are all better off because I murdered this guy. I mean, perhaps this guy really was a serial murderer or a serial rapist, and I took him out for all of your benefit, right? I advanced the common good. And in that sense, some crimes can actually be socially beneficial. If I assassinate someone who's a danger to the public, you might think, well, that's going to be that's the rational thing to do. But of course, no state that we know of responds in that way. The state is going to say it's irrelevant whether it benefited all of us or if it benefited you personally. The point is that we said, thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not steal. And you violated that norm. And that's all that's relevant, right? Maybe these questions about did you do us all a favor by killing off a serial rapist and potentially saving other people's lives, maybe that's relevant at the sentencing stage. Maybe we should be a bit more lenient in punishing you since your motives were, in a way, benevolent. But as far as the question of whether you committed a wrong is concerned, the fact that it was in your personal interest to commit the crime, or the fact that it benefited all of us that you committed the crime, is neither here nor there. The point that the authority that the state asserts is the authority to punish and apprehend anyone who violates its laws, regardless of whether it was in their personal interests to violate or not violate them. So I think it's important not to interpret Hobbes that way, because then it becomes very hard to see how his argument really amounts to a defense of state authority in the form that we certainly understand it, and I think also Hobbes understood it. So I want to warn you against that way of reading him. A better model for Hobbes's argument, I want to suggest to you, is given by the phenomenon of addiction. So consider a person who is completely addicted to a drug. And let's suppose that this is one of those drugs that is, because they're taking in so much of it, it's actually harming them physiologically. It's maybe shortening their life. The chemical expectation that he constantly get shot up on crack or whatever it might happen to be is making it impossible for him to make his way in life. He's having to, cobble together more and more money to subsidize his habit. So a drug addict like that, and there are people like this, it's a completely familiar phenomenon, understands that they have perfectly good reasons to give up the drug, right? They desperately want to kick the habit. They desperately want to no longer be an alcoholic, right? They recognize that their alcoholism or their addiction to crack is against their real interests. They know this. The difficulty is that they're in a situation, because their brains have been rewired by their addiction, where they can't actually do what they recognize they have every good reason to do. They're unable to resist the temptation to keep doing what is reinforcing the perverse situation that they're in. And I want to suggest to you that that's a better model for understanding Hobbes' state of nature. In Hobbes' state of nature, it's a collective rather than an individual problem, though, right? The problem is, in a state of nature, all of us understand that we have reasons together to cooperate in seeking peace, in following the laws of nature, in following through on our promises. The difficulty is that the structure of our situation, like the addict, makes it the case that it's extremely difficult for us to bring ourselves to actually act together on those reasons. And so we can't get to the place that we all want to go to, in exactly the way that the drug addict whose addiction prevents them from just stopping drinking or stop shooting up on crack, right? They can't kick the habit because the habit has rewired them. In a similar way, the state of nature, in effect, rewires human psychology so that under those circumstances, people will be compelled to behave in ways that only perpetuate conflict and violence and insecurity. Understood that way, Hobbes' argument for the Leviathan state is an argument that defends the state on the following grounds. We should think, Hobbes is saying, and I think this is the right way to read him, we should think of the state as a way of overcoming something like a kind of collective addiction to violence and a kind of self-perpetuating insecurity that would prevail in a state of nature, in an anarchic situation in which we lack any third-party enforcement mechanism and therefore are compelled to assert for ourselves and everybody else this right of nature in which each of us asserts the entitlement to decide for ourselves how best to pursue our own personal safety and security. So I think that's the right way to understand the problem to which Hobbes thinks the state is a solution. So how then does Hobbes think that agents can ever escape from the state of nature. What is the nature of this special agreement that he thinks will allow us to get out of this completely perverse, self-reinforcing cycle of endemic mutual fear and endemic insecurity? Well, the answer is this. Hobbes thinks there's a special kind of agreement that we can imagine, and of course this is what he's going to conceptualize as the social contract. There's a special kind of agreement we could imagine in which individuals in a state of nature all agree to lay down their right of nature on the condition that everyone accepts the direction of some third party or third party persons who then retain the right of nature. We don't make an agreement with them. We're not signing an agreement with the third party. Rather, we are signing a mutual agreement among the rest of us to accept that this third party, they get to retain the right of nature, the right to decide how best to preserve oneself. But now we all agree to let that third party exercise the right of nature no longer on its or their individual behalf, but rather on our collective behalves, right? So we could all agree, Hobbes thinks, to nominate this third-party agency to serve in that capacity, and we could all agree with each other to accept whatever he or she or it says we are to do in order to pursue and secure our lives, right? And that third party is, of course, the sovereign in Hobbes's account. That becomes the Leviathan, right? This sovereign entity that then can claim authority over us, right? So in this agreement, we, the citizens, surrender with respect to each other the right to decide for ourselves how to preserve ourselves individually, and we surrender that right together in one go to the sovereign. And we agree amongst ourselves to let the sovereign's decisions about our self-preservation be authoritative for us and to be final, right? So we all agree, okay, from now on, he, she, or it, they're going to tell us how best to preserve ourselves, and we all promise with each other that we'll follow whatever he or she says. And that, according to Hobbes, is an agreement we can imagine. And in fact, he thinks it's an agreement that, on reflection, you yourself, when you introspect and think about what you would do in a state of nature, you yourself would ratify and sign on to. Because it's for him, the obviously rational thing to do, since on his account, it's the one kind of agreement that holds out any hope of putting an end to the perpetual war of the state of nature, right? So that's the basic programmatic idea. So let me represent this to you in a diagram form, and then point out some of its consequences. And that will be enough, I think, for today's lecture. And as I look at the clock, I think I might even be able to end a little bit early and gain some of the time that I owe you back, because the last two lectures have been a little bit longer than they should have been. So we imagine all citizens agreeing with each other to obey a third party, the Leviathan, the sovereign, right? And when we agree in that way, we, of course, sort of artificially constitute the sovereign in the way that all those little scales represent individual citizens who are parties to this agreement. But it's very, very important to see the structure of this agreement. This is something that you're going to see Locke deviating from in his version of the social contract theory. It's very important to see, I've already said this, but I can't emphasize it enough, it's an absolutely central feature of Hobbes's view, that the agreement is only between citizens to each other, right? That there is no agreement between the citizens and the Leviathan, right? We just collectively agree to obey, right? The Leviathan is under no obligations to us particularly, because he's not party to the agreement. We just all agree to surrender our rights and let his right of nature now serve as the basis of his authority to preserve all of us as he sees fit. Right? That's the point of the obedience part. Right? We all agree to defer to his judgments about how we're all to be preserved, rather than, as in the state of nature, all reserving that right separately to ourselves, which again is the right of nature, and which on Hobbes's account creates the endemic problems of anarchy and the state of nature. Right? So there's no agreement here between the citizens and the Leviathan and the sovereign. There is only a unilateral agreement on the part of all the citizens to obey the sovereign state that now exercises the right of nature on our collective behalfs. And of course, I'll say more about this in the next lecture. What this does is to transform the individual effort to secure ourselves in the state of nature, right, which of course turns out to be self-defeating, because if we all try to preserve ourselves according to our own lights, what will happen in a state of nature, Hobbes thinks, is it will just perpetuate endless violence and insecurity, right? So we put an end to that pathological, perverse, self-defeating approach to self-defense, and instead establish a relationship between ourselves and a sovereign that makes space for what we would today call national security, right? So the sovereign becomes the guarantor of our collective security, and its job becomes to decide, according to its own exercise of the right of nature, how it judges it's best to preserve our lives. That becomes its basic job description, right? But again, be clear, although that's the sovereign's job description, that job description is not something that is enumerated in a contractual agreement between the citizens and the sovereign. The sovereign is completely above, because all of us agree to defer to its judgment. That's the nature of Hobbes's social contract, and of course, as we'll see, it's the reason why the Hobbesian sovereign has this terrifying power over all of us, because he retains this right to commit violence and judge that killing people and hurting people and taking things from some people and giving them to other people and so forth, that these are the things that are needful for the sake of, as we would put it today, national security, right? That's where we're kind of heading here, and I hope this is reasonably clear. I want to end today just by highlighting in a sort of rough and ready schematic form some of the relationships that Hobbes's contract, if indeed it's viable, because you might think it's not really viable, I don't understand how this could ever come about, and I'll address some of those worries later on. But for the time being, let's give him the social contract as he describes it for the sake of argument. I just want to lay out what seemed to me to be some of the new political relationships that get established in Hobbes's social contract. On the one hand, this social contract constitutes a body that we would call we the people, right? Because it creates a social situation in which there is a self-understanding shared across a political community that people share a commitment to each other to seek their own mutual self-preservation and peace and concord among them, right? And that commitment to promote our mutual self-preservation and ideally to follow through on all of the precepts of Hobbes's law of nature, that commitment takes the form of a promise to everyone else that I will agree to follow and obey whatever the sovereign asks me to do. When I agree to obey the sovereign, I agree for the sake of everybody else who is party to the contract, namely all of my fellow citizens. And that constitutes, Hobbes thinks, the people as a collective body in some particular political community that is committed to a project of mutual and collective self-preservation. And again, mutual and collective self-preservation, that's a sort of Hobbesian way of putting it. Today we would call this law and order or national security or something like that, right? So, among the things that the Hobbesian sovereign, of course, is going to take on is the responsibility for, establishing some scheme of national defense, establishing armies, establishing castles and fortresses, establishing navies, things that the sovereign judges to be the best means for securing the lives of the citizens of its state, right? And that the sovereign therefore acts on behalf of a people, and that people is defined by reference to its shared basic interest in the security of the lives of each person in the political community, right? So the people gets constituted in this story as a group of people that want to secure themselves and live in peace and concord and follow the laws of nature and all of that, right? The sovereign comes to represent, as Hobbes sometimes puts it, or using a technical term he invents in this book, personates, right? It personates the people and its will to preserve the lives of its members, right? I mean, if you ask, well, what, again, remember that this is all an argument that is trying to explain the sense in which the state is a kind of agency with its own goals, its own mission. It deliberates with a certain set of interests in mind. It speaks of a national interest, right? And on Hobbes's account, we make sense of that. We pass it out as the idea that the state and the sovereign personates its own ends as the sovereign are identical with our shared will to survive and live in peace and relative prosperity and in a degree of security. And it exercises the right of nature on the people's collective behalf, and it determines the specific norms and rules by which, if you want to put it this way, project self-preservation is to be pursued. And it does this by promulgating general laws, by establishing governments, establishing the rule of law, court systems to adjudicate disputes, various mechanisms to enforce contracts and agreements and promises, all the things that we would ordinarily think of as the state, the modern state, doing, right? So you can see here that there are the outlines of a pretty familiar looking institution that is not a million miles from what we tend to take for granted. Individual citizens are now in a new relationship to each other and this sovereign entity that represents or personates their collective will to survive, right? Because what happens now is that citizens are in a position to appeal to a third-party enforcement mechanism, the sovereign, when disputes arise about whether someone has taken something that belongs to another person from them, or whether someone has illegitimately killed another person against the rules. This whole setup permits a basis on which we can hold each other accountable to one another by appealing to a third party. And when we appeal to a third party, in this case the sovereign, right, what we're basically accusing our fellow citizens of doing, if we think they've done something wrong, we're saying, well, you violated the laws that you agreed you would follow, because we all agreed in the social contract to surrender our judgment and to let our actions be controlled by the sovereign. So if you break the law or disobey the sovereign's commands, you fail to pay your taxes, fail to get your car inspected, the state will force you to fulfill your commitment to your compatriots, right? And now you're able to hold your compatriots to account through the institutions of state power and overcome the various problems that we saw plaguing the effort to cooperate in the state of nature: the time problem, the assurance problem, and the information problem. That sets out the basic outline terms of Hobbes's contract. Okay, I'll stop there, and we will push on into this, but there's ample here in these two lectures, I think, for you to get some interesting conversations going in your discussion section. So I hope you enjoy them, and I will see you all next week. Thank you very much for listening. Take care.